I'm going to do a reading from Seed to Civilization, Story of Man's Food by Charles B. Heiser, Jr., published in 1973. This is from Chapter 5 on grasses. The section is on rice. In Japan each year, the emperor himself, still patron of all agriculture, although no longer regarded as the descendant of the sun, joins in the ritual harvest of the rice on the small imperial paddy field in the palace grounds. Rice is still regarded as a sacred plant by many people in much of Asia. Although of more limited distribution than wheat, rice feeds more people, since it constitutes the basic food of more than half of mankind. Far less is known about the origin of rice than about the other important cereals, but there is little doubt that its cultivation arose in southeastern Asia, where it continues to be of paramount importance. Archaeological evidence of it is known from Thailand, dating back to the period from 5000 to 3500 BC, but it could be that its origin is even earlier, for the archaeological record of plants from this part of the world is much poorer than it is for the Near East and the Americas. Rice reached Japan from China during the 2nd century BC. At this time, it was already known in Europe, for it had been carried to Greece by Arab traders and again during Alexander the Great's invasion of the East. The scientific name oryza, applied to the plant by Linnaeus, comes from an ancient Greek word for rice that in turn is derived from an Arab word or a Chinese word. Opinion is divided among scholars. The Chinese word means, quote unquote, good grain of life. Not surprisingly, the word for rice is the same as that for life, food, or agriculture in many parts of the Far East. Rice is mentioned in very ancient Chinese writings, as it is in early Hindu scriptures. Several different varieties of rice are described in the ancient Dravidian literature of India. Linguistic evidence, as well as botanical, suggests an origin for the plant somewhere in southeastern Asia. There are about 25 species of oryza, and of these, one species, Oryza sativa, furnishes virtually all of the rice of the world today. A second domesticated species, Oryza glaberrima, is still cultivated in West Africa, presumably in the same area where it originated. Of the wild species, Oryza perennis, widely distributed throughout the humid tropics of the world, appears to be the most likely progenitor of Oryza sativa. This wild rice. Footnote: there is another plant known as wild rice that is also used for food. It is a grass, but is not very closely related to true rice or oryza. This wild rice, Zizania aquatica, is an annual, native to eastern North America, and was an important food plant of the Indians of the Great Lakes region, particularly in what is now Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Manitoba. The plant is not cultivated, but it is still collected by Indians for their own use and as a cash crop. At one point, outsiders introduced mechanical means of harvesting the crop that could have proved disastrous if their use had gone unchecked. The more primitive methods always left plenty of seeds to reestablish the plants for the next season, but with the more efficient mechanical method, most of the seeds were collected and the species was threatened with extinction. Fortunately, some laws were passed governing the harvest in time that the plant still survives. Presumably was collected by primitive man, just as wheat was, and eventually became intentionally grown. With cultivation, mutant types were selected, and in time man had an annual with larger grains and non-shattering fruit stalks, and sometimes lacking the awns of the wild species. Hybridization of the cultivated rice with various wild species also appears to have contributed to the development and the great variability of this plant. Wild rice is still collected by some people and is the preferred plant in some ancient religious ceremonies in southeastern Asia. Although some tetraploid races are known, most varieties of rice are diploid, having 24 chromosomes. Rice was introduced into the Carolinas in 1647, but today California, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas are the rice-growing areas of the United States, and more than half of the rice produced goes for export. As the average per-person consumption of rice in the United States is only 6 pounds a year, not a great deal need be produced to meet the domestic demand. Some rice is grown in Africa, South America, and Europe, and it is an important food in many areas. In many parts of Latin America, rice and beans are served with every meal and sometimes constitute the whole meal. But it is in its original homeland that rice is dominant, where more than 90% of the world's crop is produced, and where people, on the average, consume as much rice in a week as the average American eats in a whole year. Throughout much of southeastern Asia, rice is grown as it has been for many centuries, requiring tremendous human effort. It has been estimated that in some regions, 1,000 man-hours are needed to grow and harvest a single acre of rice. A great many people still cultivate very small patches of rice from 1 to 5 acres. As methods vary somewhat from region to region, a generalized description is impossible, but the following steps are very common. The paddy fields are prepared for planting with a wooden single-furrow plow drawn by a water buffalo or ox. Manure, if available, is scattered on the field. The plowed land is then smoothed with a log. After the dikes have been repaired, water drawn by primitive water wheels is used to flood the fields in areas where rain is not sufficient for this purpose. The rice is then planted either by broadcasting dry or previously germinated seed, or by transplanting seedlings or young plants that have been grown in a nursery bed. The customary way of planting most cereals is directly by seed, and knowledge of the origin of transplanting seedlings by hand would be of interest. Carl Sauer has postulated that the latter is the older method, first used by people who had practiced vegetative cultivation of other crops, transplanting being similar to starting plants from cuttings or other vegetative means. Broadcasting dry seeds might have been derived from contact with wheat farmers at a later date. It is not definitely known which is the older method. Transplanting, back-breaking work that requires much stooping, is usually done by women and children. Some pruning of the tops and the roots of plants normally accompanies transplantation, and some people believe that this pruning stimulates growth of the young plant and leads to higher yields than when seeds are broadcast. Weeds present less of a problem when rice is transplanted than when seed is planted directly, and having less competition from weeds could also help account for greater yields being obtained through the transplanting method. After the plants are established, any necessary weeding is done by hand, another activity that requires much stooping. Harvesting is done with sickles or knives. With the latter, the seed heads are gently cut individually, the idea still existing in some regions that if the cutting is harsh, the rice plant will be offended and the yield will be decreased the following season. Threshing is done by beating the heads against the ground or against logs, or by having animals or barefoot humans tread upon the seed heads. Sometimes women who do the treading are bare-breasted, which is thought to be related to an ancient belief that the less they wear, the thinner the rice husks will be. Winnowing to remove the chaff from the grain is still often accomplished by tossing the rice from bamboo or rattan trays and allowing the wind to blow away the lighter chaff while the grain settles nearby. All of these methods, of course, contrast strikingly with the highly mechanized procedures practiced in the United States and some other countries, where airplanes are often employed for seeding, which allows the grain to be produced economically in spite of high labor costs. Following winnowing, under primitive conditions, a mortar and pestle are used for hulling, and the brown rice that results may be promptly cooked for local consumption. In industrial preparation, pearling or whitening is used to remove the bran or outer layers of the grain, and sometimes this is followed by polishing. The final product is pleasing in appearance and taste, but less nutritious than brown rice. Unfortunately, just as with bread, most people prefer white rice to brown. The loss of nutrients, particularly vitamin B1, eliminated in the process of milling and cooking, has been responsible for much malnutrition and diseases, such as beriberi, among people whose diet consists almost entirely of white rice. Highly milled rice contains only 0.04 milligrams of vitamin B1 per 100 grams, compared to 0.40 milligrams in the unmilled. The latter amount is sufficient to prevent beriberi. White rice, of course, can be fortified with additives to increase its nutritional value. Rice, although not a true aquatic plant, is unusual among the cereals in that its roots can thrive underwater. Thus it is an ideal plant for much of the humid tropics, although at times it can get too much water, for proper drainage is essential to good growth. Rice also can be grown much as the other cereals. Dry upland rice or hill paddy is grown in some areas that have the proper temperature and sufficient rainfall. Yields, however, are generally lower than for lowland rice. The thousands of quote-unquote varieties of rice are generally classed or divided into two major groups: the Japonica types, which have short grains and are sticky when cooked, and the Indica types, which have long grains and are drier when cooked. The Japonica types, grown in both Japan and Taiwan, in general are higher yielding than are the Indica types, which are grown throughout the greater part of Southeast Asia. World hunger could be at least partially reduced through the wider distribution of higher yielding varieties. One of the obstacles to achieving this goal, however, lies in the difficulty of persuading people to accept new foods. People the world over usually prefer their local varieties, and if they are used to eating a sticky rice, for example, they are often reluctant to change to a dry type, and vice versa. The rice plant, of course, directly or indirectly serves man in many ways other than for food. Beer and wines may be made from the grain, the most famous of which is sake, the quote-unquote national beverage of Japan. Rice is also used in the manufacture of beer in the United States and other countries. Rice is used for the production of starch, and rice powder is used as a cosmetic in parts of the Far East. The hulls or husks of the grain are used as fuel in making building materials, for the manufacture of furfural, which in turn is used to make plastics, and in other ways. The straw, of course, is not overlooked and is used in the manufacture of baskets, mats, and straw board. Like wheat, the straw is not very nutritious, but is sometimes used for livestock feed. Paper can be made from rice straw, but what is commonly known as rice paper is made from another plant, Tetrapanax papiferus, or rice paper plant, which is native to the Orient, but is not a grass. Perhaps the most important byproduct of rice farming doesn't come from the plant itself, for paddy fields are frequently used for raising fish. A rice diet is extremely deficient in protein, and fish, of course, is an excellent protein source. In many rice-growing areas, ponds are kept for fish hatcheries, and minnows, usually carp, are introduced into the paddy fields. The fish, rather than decreasing rice production, actually appear to promote its fertility. Without the fish in the wet rice fields, other problems may arise, as was discovered in the south coastal area of the United States some years ago, when huge swarms of mosquitoes found the rice fields ideal breeding grounds. In parts of Asia, the recent use of modern pesticides has had a deleterious effect on the fish population. Of the many diseases of rice, one has proven to be of particular scientific interest. The bakane, or quote-unquote foolish seedling disease, which produces unusually tall, thin plants, was found by Japanese botanists to be caused by a fungus, Gibberella fujikuroi. They found that a growth substance, now known as gibberellin, could be isolated from the fungus, and this substance has been the subject of considerable scientific work by American and English botanists as well as the Japanese since World War II. Gibberellins are used to produce growth in some dwarf plants and to induce flowering in others. Although some efforts to improve the rice plant have been carried on for many years, and high-yielding strains have been grown in Japan and Formosa, much of Asia still grows its old, unproductive types under very primitive conditions. Recognizing the need for improvement in a plant that feeds a great part of the world's population, the Ford Foundation, in cooperation with the Rockefeller Foundation, established the International Rice Research Institution in the Philippines. With scientists representing many different disciplines assembled from the United States and 6 Eastern nations, the IRRI began its work in 1962. It was soon found that although rice was a much-studied plant, there was still much room for basic research. Effort was devoted to learning more about the plant, and this search for basic knowledge still continues. It was known that one of the great drawbacks of Asiatic rice was its tendency to lodge or fall over as the plants reached maturity. Fertilization that would improve yields of such plants would only contribute to lodging, since it would produce taller plants with heavier heads. The rice scientists realize that an ideal rice plant would be a short one with a strong stem that could take additional amounts of fertilizer. Over 10,000 different samples of rice seed from many different areas were assembled. Through hybridization, the IRRI scientists attempted to produce a plant having the desirable characters, and one of the crosses involving a short rice from Taiwan called D. Geowugen and one from Indonesia called Pita already has shown extremely high yields where it has been tested, not only in the Far East, but in South America and Africa as well. The new plant, designated IR8, reaches maturity in 130 days and is insensitive to day length, making it adaptable to many regions and making it possible to grow more than one crop a year in some places. Other high-yielding varieties have since been developed. The IRRI did not neglect other aspects of growing rice: fertilization, irrigation, disease control, and even produced an inexpensive threshing machine that could be widely used. Thus, in the space of a few years, through a highly concentrated effort, rice yields increased dramatically, which is already contributing to the Green Revolution. What is still needed is a rice that has a higher protein content, for rice contains even less protein than wheat and maize, and the newly produced varieties may have protein contents even lower than that of some of the older, lower-yielding varieties.